In the winter of 1942, inside a labor camp on the outskirts of Munich, Germany, a nurse stood before a decision that would either save lives or end her own. Margarete Fischer held a glass vial of blood in her trembling hand, staring at the test results she had just fabricated. The numbers were false. The diagnosis was a lie, and if discovered, the penalty was immediate execution. But on the other side of that laboratory door, 37 Jewish prisoners waited in a cramped medical ward, unaware that their fate now rested on a few drops of manipulated blood and one woman's willingness to commit treason against the Third Reich. This is the story they buried in the ashes of history. This is the story of the nurse who turned medicine into a weapon of mercy, and how a simple blood test became the difference between the gas chamber and one more day of life. By the end of this video, you'll discover how far one ordinary person went to sabotage the Nazi death machine from the inside, and why her name was erased from every official record. Before the sirens of war tore through Europe, Margarete Fischer was nothing more than a dedicated nurse working at Munich's largest public hospital. She had graduated top of her class in 1936, specializing in hematology and infectious diseases. Her colleagues knew her as meticulous, quiet, and utterly devoted to the Hippocratic Oath. She wore her nurse's uniform with pride, spent long shifts caring for tuberculosis patients, and never missed a single day of work. Margarete came from a family of modest means. Her father was a school teacher, her mother a seamstress. They lived in a small apartment near the Isar River, where Sunday dinners were sacred and political conversations were carefully avoided. Like millions of Germans, Margarete witnessed the rise of the Nazi Party with a mixture of confusion and silent dread. She saw the flags multiply on every street corner. She heard the speeches blaring from radios in hospital corridors. But she kept her head down, focused on her patients, and told herself that medicine existed above politics. Everything changed in the autumn of 1941 when the hospital administrators gathered the entire medical staff for a mandatory assembly. A high-ranking SS officer stood at the podium and announced a new directive. All medical professionals would be reassigned according to the needs of the Reich. Margarete, along with 12 other nurses and 3 doctors, received orders to report to a facility 70 kilometers outside the city. They were told it was a labor camp for enemies of the state, that their role would be to maintain basic health standards among the workforce, and that questions were neither welcomed nor tolerated. The reassignment was immediate. Within 48 hours, Margarete packed a single suitcase, said goodbye to her parents without explaining where she was going, and boarded a military transport truck that drove through the Bavarian countryside in complete silence. When she arrived at the camp gates, the first thing she noticed was the smell. It was the scent of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and something else she couldn't immediately identify, but would later recognize as the odor of fear itself. The camp was not Auschwitz or Treblinka. It was smaller, designed as a forced labor site where Jewish prisoners worked in nearby munitions factories and textile mills. The conditions were brutal, but not immediately lethal. Prisoners received minimal food rations, slept in overcrowded barracks, and worked 12-hour shifts under armed guard. The medical facility where Margarete was stationed consisted of 2 rooms. One served as an examination area with a single wooden table and a cabinet of outdated supplies. The other was a laboratory equipped with basic equipment for blood work, urine analysis, and tuberculosis screening. Her supervisor was Dr. Ernst Bachmann, a thin man in his 50s, who spoke in clipped sentences and avoided eye contact. He explained her duties with mechanical precision. She would conduct routine health screenings, document illnesses, and most importantly, perform blood tests on prisoners selected for transport. Transport was the euphemism everyone used, but nobody explained where the transports actually went. During her first week, Margarete performed her duties exactly as instructed. She drew blood, recorded results, and handed her reports to Dr. Bachmann without question. The prisoners who came through her examination room were walking skeletons. Their eyes were hollow, their skin stretched tight over protruding bones, and many could barely stand without assistance. She treated infected wounds with limited supplies, diagnosed advanced stages of malnutrition she had no resources to reverse, and watched as those declared fit for transport were loaded onto trucks that disappeared into the night. On the 8th day, a young woman named Sarah Rosenfeld was brought to her examination room. Sarah was 23 years old, a former university student from Berlin, and she was coughing blood into a torn piece of cloth. Margarete performed the standard examination and drew blood for testing. The results came back clear. No tuberculosis, no typhus. According to the protocols, Sarah was fit for transport. But when Margarete looked into Sarah's terrified eyes, something inside her shattered. She thought about her own life before the war, about the oath she had sworn, and about the growing certainty that transport meant death. That night, alone in the laboratory, after Dr. Bachmann had gone to his quarters, Margarete Fischer made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She pulled out Sarah Rosenfeld's blood sample and the test results she had recorded earlier. With hands that had stopped trembling, she carefully falsified the numbers. She altered the white blood cell count to indicate severe infection. She fabricated markers for advanced tuberculosis. She transformed a healthy blood panel into a medical emergency. The next morning, she submitted her revised report declaring Sarah Rosenfeld unfit for transport due to contagious disease. Sarah was removed from the transport list and sent to an isolation ward. She would live at least another week. And Margarete Fischer, standing in that laboratory surrounded by vials of blood and the weight of her choice, realized she had just crossed a line from which there was no return. She had become something the Reich would hunt without mercy. She had become a saboteur. The system that Margarete Fischer had just decided to sabotage was built on cold efficiency and meticulous documentation. Every prisoner in the camp existed as a number in a ledger, a name on a transport list, and a potential liability to be eliminated when their labor value diminished. The selection process for transports followed a brutal logic that disguised mass murder as administrative necessity. Each week, Sturmbannführer Wilhelm Krause arrived at the camp with updated quotas from Berlin. He needed specific numbers of prisoners sent east to what the official documents vaguely referred to as resettlement facilities. The camp commandant would review the prisoner population and determine who could be spared from the labor force. Those too weak to work, those who had become ill, and those who simply had the misfortune of being selected when quotas needed to be filled were marked for the next transport. But before any prisoner could be loaded onto the cattle cars that waited at the nearby railway station, they had to pass through the medical screening facility where Margarete now worked. The medical screening served a dual purpose that revealed the twisted bureaucracy of the Nazi death machine. First, it provided a veneer of scientific legitimacy to the selection process, as if the decision to send someone to their death was based on objective medical criteria rather than genocidal policy. Second, and more practically, it prevented the spread of contagious diseases to the labor camps and factories that still needed functioning workers. Prisoners with tuberculosis, typhus, or other infectious diseases were supposed to be quarantined and treated until they either recovered or died in isolation. This created a narrow window of opportunity that Margarete had stumbled upon almost by accident. If a prisoner was declared medically unfit due to contagious illness, they were temporarily removed from transport lists and placed in the isolation ward. Dr. Bachmann oversaw the process with bureaucratic indifference, rarely questioning the test results Margarete submitted. He seemed more concerned with maintaining proper documentation than with verifying the accuracy of individual diagnoses. In the days following her decision to falsify Sarah Rosenfeld's blood test, Margarete moved through the camp in a state of heightened awareness. She studied the routines of the guards, memorized the schedule of Sturmbannführer Krause's visits, and learned to recognize which prisoners were likely to appear on the next transport list. She discovered that the camp operated on a predictable rhythm. Transports departed every 2 weeks, usually on Thursday mornings. 3 days before each transport, Dr. Bachmann would receive a preliminary list of prisoners selected for medical screening. Margarete's role was to examine these prisoners, conduct blood tests and submit her findings within 48 hours. The final transport list was compiled on Wednesday afternoon, and by Thursday dawn, the selected prisoners were marched to the railway station. Understanding this timeline became crucial to Margarete's emerging strategy. She realized that she had a small window between receiving the preliminary list and submitting her medical reports to make decisions that could alter who lived and who died. The isolation ward became her sanctuary of deception. It was a separate barracks located on the eastern edge of the camp, designated for prisoners with contagious diseases. The ward was deliberately kept away from the main population and was guarded less heavily because the guards themselves feared infection. Conditions inside were marginally better than the regular barracks, simply because overcrowding posed a risk of spreading disease further. Margarete began to carefully manipulate her diagnoses to route specific prisoners into this isolation ward. A young mother whose children had already been transported received a falsified diagnosis of early-stage tuberculosis. An elderly rabbi who could barely walk was documented as having a severe blood infection that required immediate quarantine. A teenage boy who reminded Margarete of her younger brother was declared to have suspicious symptoms of typhus, pending further testing. Each falsified report bought these prisoners another 2 weeks of life, and sometimes, in the chaos of war and the inefficiency of bureaucracy, they were simply forgotten on subsequent transport lists. But Margarete understood with growing clarity that her actions existed on borrowed time. The laboratory supplies were limited, and she couldn't fabricate endless cases of infectious disease without eventually drawing suspicion. Dr. Bachmann was indifferent but not blind, and if too many prisoners suddenly developed rare blood disorders or unusual infection patterns, questions would be asked. More dangerously, Sturmbannführer Krause was a meticulous man who reviewed transport quotas with obsessive attention to detail. If the camp consistently failed to meet its required numbers because too many prisoners were declared medically unfit, an investigation would follow. Margarete knew that discovery meant immediate execution, probably after torture to reveal if she was working with an organized resistance network. Yet every time she held a vial of blood in her hands and stared at the test results, she made the same choice. She picked up her pen, altered the numbers, and signed her name to another lie that might save another life. The weight of each decision pressed down on her shoulders like stones, but stopping felt like a betrayal of everything she had once believed medicine represented. The first sign that Margarete's deception might be noticed came on a cold morning in early March of 1942. Dr. Bachmann entered the laboratory carrying a folder of medical reports and placed them on the table with unusual deliberation. He stood silently for a moment, studying Margarete with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he asked a question that made her blood freeze. Why had the incidence of tuberculosis cases increased by 40% in the past month, when the overall camp population had decreased? Margarete felt her throat tighten, but she had prepared for this moment during countless sleepless nights. She explained calmly that overcrowding in the barracks created ideal conditions for airborne disease transmission, that the winter cold weakened immune systems already compromised by malnutrition, and that many prisoners arrived at the camp already infected but asymptomatic. Dr. Bachmann listened without interrupting, his pale eyes fixed on her face. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly and left the laboratory without another word. Margarete stood alone, her hands gripping the edge of the examination table, realizing how close she had come to exposure. That encounter forced Margarete to evolve her strategy with greater sophistication. She could no longer simply fabricate tuberculosis cases at will. She needed to vary her diagnoses, spread them across different medical conditions, and most crucially, ensure that some prisoners she examined were declared fit for transport to maintain the appearance of objectivity. This meant making choices that haunted her conscience in ways she had never imagined possible. When a group of 20 prisoners arrived for medical screening, Margarete would carefully assess each one. She looked for those who seemed strongest, who might survive the transport to wherever the trains actually went. Those individuals received accurate test results and were cleared for departure. But the elderly, the visibly ill, the mothers with young children still in the camp, and those whose eyes held a particular desperation that she recognized as the edge of complete breakdown, these were the ones whose blood tests she manipulated. She falsified diagnoses of anemia, so severe it posed contamination risks to other workers. She invented heart conditions that made physical labor dangerous. She created medical crises that existed only on paper, but were documented with enough clinical detail to appear legitimate. The isolation ward gradually filled with prisoners whose lives Margarete had extended through medical fraud. Sarah Rosenfeld remained there for 6 weeks, slowly recovering from the tuberculosis she never actually had. An older man named David Cohn, a former bookstore owner from Frankfurt, lived in isolation for 2 months based on a fabricated kidney disorder. A young girl barely 16 years old named Miriam Weiss avoided 3 consecutive transports because Margarete's reports indicated she was battling a resistant blood infection that required extended observation. These prisoners began to understand, though nothing was ever spoken aloud, that something unusual was protecting them. They noticed that Margarete's examinations were longer than Dr. Bachmann's, that she asked questions about their families and their lives before the war, and that those she examined thoroughly often found themselves transferred to isolation rather than transport lists. A silent understanding developed between the nurse and her patients, built on glances that lasted a fraction too long and the gentleness of her touch when drawing blood. But the camp itself was changing in ways that made Margarete's mission increasingly dangerous. In April of 1942, Sturmbannführer Krause received new orders from Berlin demanding increased efficiency in processing prisoners. The labor requirements from nearby factories had decreased as production shifted to facilities closer to the Eastern Front. This meant the camp's primary purpose was transitioning from forced labor to serving as a collection point for transports heading east. The frequency of departures increased from every 2 weeks to every 10 days. The medical screening process was accelerated, with Dr. Bachmann receiving instructions to process larger groups of prisoners in shorter timeframes. Margarete found herself examining 40 or 50 people in a single day, making rapid decisions about who would live and who would die based on assessments that lasted mere minutes. The pressure was suffocating. Her hands developed a slight tremor that made drawing blood more difficult. She lost weight, sleeping only 3 or 4 hours each night, haunted by the faces of those she couldn't save. The moral calculus of her position became unbearable, in ways she struggled to articulate even to herself. Every prisoner she saved by falsifying their medical results meant that someone else, someone equally deserving of life, took their place on the transport list. The quotas were fixed. If 30 prisoners were required for Thursday's transport, and Margarete declared 5 of them medically unfit, then 5 others would be selected from the general population to fill those spaces. She was not reducing the total number of deaths. She was only choosing which specific individuals would die and which would survive a little longer. This realization settled over her like a weight that made breathing difficult. Late at night in her small quarters, she would ask herself questions that had no answers. What gave her the right to decide that Sarah Rosenfeld's life was worth more than another woman she had never examined? How could she justify saving an elderly rabbi while a young man with decades of potential life ahead went to his death? The mathematics of genocide offered no moral clarity, only impossible choices wrapped in the illusion of control. By May of 1942, Margarete Fischer had developed a system of deception so elaborate that it required her to maintain 2 separate sets of mental records. She memorized which prisoners she had diagnosed with which fabricated illnesses, tracking the progression of diseases that didn't exist to ensure consistency if Dr. Bachmann or the SS officers ever cross-referenced her reports. A prisoner she had declared to have early-stage tuberculosis in March needed to show either improvement or deterioration by May, and Margarete had to manufacture test results that reflected a believable disease trajectory. She became an expert in medical forgery, learning exactly how much she could manipulate blood counts before the numbers became statistically impossible. She understood that a white blood cell count could fluctuate within certain ranges without raising suspicion. But if she pushed the numbers too far outside normal parameters, even Dr. Bachmann's indifference would give way to questions. She taught herself to create illnesses that were serious enough to justify quarantine, but not so severe that they would require treatments the camp couldn't provide, or worse, prompt the SS to simply execute the prisoner as a burden on resources. The laboratory became her theater of resistance, and every vial of blood was both evidence and weapon. Margarete discovered that timing was as crucial as the falsification itself. She learned to delay submitting certain test results until the last possible moment before transport lists were finalized, gambling that the administrative chaos of the camp would work in her favor. Sometimes she would claim that a blood sample had been contaminated and needed to be redrawn, buying an extra day or two for a prisoner whose name she recognized from previous screenings. Other times, she would strategically misplace paperwork, forcing Dr. Bachmann to request duplicate reports that she would then alter slightly to indicate a worsening condition. These were small acts of sabotage, almost invisible within the vast machinery of the Holocaust, but each one represented a conscious choice to throw sand into the gears of genocide. The camp administration operated on the assumption that medical personnel were neutral functionaries, simply documenting objective facts. Margarete exploited that assumption ruthlessly, understanding that her white coat and her professional credentials granted her a degree of trust that she was systematically betraying. The prisoners in the isolation ward became an unintended community of the temporarily saved. They existed in a strange limbo, aware that their quarantine was both a reprieve and merely a postponement of the inevitable. Sarah Rosenfeld had been there long enough to recognize the pattern of new arrivals, each one brought in with a diagnosis that seemed just severe enough to justify their separation from the transport lists. She began to organize the ward with quiet efficiency, helping newcomers understand the unspoken rules of survival in this peculiar space. The prisoners shared their meager food rations, cared for those who were genuinely ill, and maintained the fiction of their fabricated diseases when guards or SS officers conducted inspections. They coughed on cue when diagnosed with tuberculosis. They feigned weakness when their papers indicated blood disorders. They became actors in a performance choreographed by Margaret's forged documents, understanding that their lives depended on making the lies believable. Some prisoners whispered prayers of gratitude for the nurse who examined them, with gentle hands and kind eyes. Others simply accepted their temporary salvation with the numb resignation of people who had learned not to question small mercies in a world designed for their annihilation. But the isolation ward's population could only grow so large before it became a liability that even the camp's inefficient bureaucracy couldn't ignore. By late May, over 60 prisoners were housed in a barracks designed for 30. The overcrowding that Margarete had cited as a cause of disease transmission was now becoming a genuine medical crisis. Prisoners with fabricated illnesses were living in close quarters with those who were actually sick, creating conditions where real infections could spread. The camp administration began to notice the drain on already limited medical supplies. Bandages, disinfectant, and the small quantities of medicine available were being consumed by the isolation ward at rates that didn't align with the camp's overall population. Questions started circulating among the SS officers about why this particular labor camp seemed to have such unusually high rates of infectious disease compared to other facilities in the region. Sturmbannführer Krause made increasingly frequent visits to the medical facility, reviewing reports with an attention to detail that made Margaret's hands shake when she handed him her documents. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in early June, when an SS medical inspector arrived unannounced from Berlin. His name was Dr. Friedrich Steiner, and unlike Dr. Bachmann, he was a true believer in Nazi racial science with credentials from prestigious universities and a reputation for rooting out inefficiency in camp medical operations. He carried a leather briefcase filled with statistical analyses of disease rates across labor camps in Germany and occupied territories. He had noticed anomalies in the reports coming from Margaret's camp, specifically the unusually high incidence of tuberculosis and blood disorders among Jewish prisoners compared to national averages. Dr. Steiner informed the camp commandant that he would be conducting a comprehensive audit of the medical facility, including reviewing all patient records from the past 6 months, re-examining prisoners currently in isolation, and personally verifying the accuracy of diagnostic procedures. He would begin his inspection the following Monday. Margarete had 4 days to prepare for an investigation that would almost certainly expose her deception and result in her execution. The wall she had built between survival and discovery was finally about to collapse. The weekend before Dr. Steiner's scheduled inspection became a crucible of impossible decisions for Margarete Fischer. She spent Friday night alone in the laboratory, surrounded by 6 months of fabricated medical records that represented her life's work of defiance and the documentary evidence of her treason. Every falsified blood test, every invented diagnosis, every manipulated report lay spread across the examination table, like pieces of a confession waiting to be assembled. Dr. Steiner was not Dr. Bachmann. He would not accept vague explanations about overcrowding or seasonal disease patterns. He would demand to see the original blood samples, which no longer existed. He would re-examine prisoners she had diagnosed with tuberculosis and find healthy lungs. He would compare her statistical anomalies against regional data and recognize patterns that could only exist through systematic fraud. Margarete understood with absolute clarity that she had approximately 96 hours before discovery, disgrace, and death. The only question that mattered now was what she would do with that time. Her first instinct was to destroy the evidence, but she quickly realized the futility of that approach. The medical records existed in multiple copies, with duplicates filed in the camp administrative office and monthly summaries sent to regional SS headquarters. Burning her laboratory copies would only highlight her guilt when Dr. Steiner arrived and found gaps in the documentation. She considered fleeing, simply walking away from the camp and disappearing into the chaos of wartime Germany. But that fantasy dissolved as quickly as it formed. The country was blanketed with checkpoints. Identity papers were scrutinized constantly, and a lone woman traveling without authorization would be arrested within hours. Even if she somehow managed to escape, her absence would trigger immediate investigations that would likely result in brutal reprisals against the prisoners she had tried to protect. Running would save her life, but destroy everything she had risked that life to accomplish. So Margarete made a different choice, one that surprised even herself with its cold calculation. She decided to selectively sacrifice some of her deceptions to protect others. Saturday morning, Margarete began the grim work of triage applied to her own forgeries. She reviewed every falsified diagnosis from the past 6 months and categorized them into 3 groups. The first group consisted of prisoners whose fabricated illnesses were least likely to withstand Dr. Steiner's scrutiny, cases where she had pushed the medical parameters too far or where the diagnosed conditions would be immediately disprovable through re-examination. These were her most vulnerable deceptions, and she made the agonizing decision to correct them. She prepared revised medical reports indicating that these prisoners had recovered from their illnesses and were now fit for standard camp duties, knowing that this revision would place most of them on the next transport list. The second group included prisoners whose false diagnoses were moderate in risk, cases where she had been more careful with the medical details and where Dr. Steiner might accept her original findings if she defended them convincingly. These reports she left unchanged, gambling that she could argue for their validity during the inspection. The third group represented her most sophisticated forgeries, prisoners whose fabricated medical conditions were supported by such meticulous false documentation that they might actually survive intense scrutiny. These were the lives she chose to defend with everything she had. Sarah Rosenfeld fell into the third category. Over the months of her supposed tuberculosis treatment, Margarete had created such an elaborate medical history for her that the documentation almost constituted a work of art in deception. She had fabricated not just blood tests, but also detailed physical examination notes, temperature charts showing fever patterns consistent with the disease, and even invented consultations with specialists who didn't exist. Margarete had invested so much careful work into Sarah's false diagnosis that she believed it could withstand inspection if she was willing to stake her credibility on defending it. David Cohn, the elderly bookseller with the fabricated kidney disorder, also made it into this protected category. His case file was thick with months of documentation, showing a chronic condition that required ongoing monitoring, but wasn't immediately life-threatening. But young Miriam Weiss, the 16-year-old girl with the invented blood infection, fell into the first category. Her diagnosis had been created hastily during a moment when Margarete was processing too many prisoners too quickly, and the medical details wouldn't hold up under expert review. Margarete spent Saturday night rewriting Miriam's medical file, documenting a miraculous recovery that would clear her for the Tuesday transport. She cried while writing those words, knowing exactly what they meant. Sunday brought a development that changed everything. Dr. Bachmann summoned Margarete to his office with unusual urgency. When she arrived, she found him sitting behind his desk with an expression of what looked almost like concern. He informed her that he had reviewed the camp's medical records in preparation for Dr. Steiner's inspection and had noticed certain irregularities that troubled him. Margarete's heart hammered against her ribs, certain that this was the moment of exposure. But then Dr. Bachmann said something completely unexpected. He told her that he understood the pressures she had been under, that medical work in a labor camp created ethical dilemmas that their training had never prepared them for, and that he had himself struggled with the gap between his responsibilities as a physician and his duties to the Reich. He opened his desk drawer and removed a bottle of schnapps, poured 2 glasses, and handed one to Margarete. Then he proposed that they spend the evening reviewing the medical records together and ensuring that everything was in order before Dr. Steiner's arrival. He suggested that any inconsistencies or errors could be quietly corrected, and that 2 medical professionals working together could present a united front that would satisfy even the most rigorous inspection. It was not quite an admission that he knew what she had been doing, and not quite an offer of complicity, but something ambiguous that existed in the shadows between those 2 positions. Margarete accepted the glass, met his eyes, and understood that she had just gained an unexpected and deeply compromised ally. The collaboration between Margarete Fischer and Dr. Ernst Bachmann that Sunday evening revealed layers of moral complexity neither of them had anticipated. They sat in his cramped office until past midnight, medical files spread across every available surface, speaking in careful euphemisms about irregularities and inconsistencies, while both understanding the true nature of what they were discussing. Dr. Bachmann proved to be far more observant than Margarete had ever realized. He pointed to specific cases where her diagnoses seemed unusually convenient in their timing, appearing just hours before transport lists were finalized. He noted patterns in her blood work documentation where certain types of results occurred with statistical improbability. But rather than confronting her with accusations, he framed these observations as potential vulnerabilities that Dr. Steiner might exploit. He suggested revisions that would make the records appear more medically sound while quietly preserving many of Margarete's most important deceptions. When he proposed correcting a tuberculosis diagnosis for a prisoner named Jakob Friedman, Margarete countered by offering detailed clinical reasoning for why the diagnosis was legitimate, and after a moment of tense silence, Dr. Bachmann nodded and moved on to the next file. What emerged from their nocturnal collaboration was a tacit agreement built on mutual self-preservation, wrapped around something that might have been conscience. Dr. Bachmann had his own reasons for helping Margarete survive the inspection, reasons he never fully articulated, but that she began to understand through small revelations scattered across their conversation. He mentioned a sister who had married a Jewish violinist before the war, a woman he hadn't seen since 1939, and whose fate he didn't know. He spoke briefly about his medical training in Vienna, working alongside Jewish colleagues whose brilliance had shaped his understanding of medicine and who had disappeared into the machinery of deportation. He admitted that he had spent 3 years in this camp, processing prisoners for transport, while telling himself that he was merely documenting objective medical facts, but that somewhere along the way he had stopped being able to sleep through the night. Dr. Bachmann was not offering redemption or claiming moral equivalence with Margarete's active resistance. He was simply acknowledging that he had reached a point where he could no longer pretend complete ignorance about what his medical reports actually meant and where they sent people. Together, they constructed a defense strategy for the inspection that relied on burying Margarete's most egregious fabrications under layers of legitimate medical complexity. They identified 23 cases in the isolation ward where the diagnoses were vulnerable to expert scrutiny. 15 of those prisoners would need to be cleared for transport or reassignment to the general camp population before Dr. Steiner arrived. This meant condemning 15 people to death, or to whatever waited at the end of the railway line, a decision that Margarete and Dr. Bachmann made while sitting across from each other with schnapps glasses and medical files and the sound of distant guard dogs barking in the night. They chose the youngest and strongest among the vulnerable cases, applying a brutal logic that these individuals had the best chance of surviving whatever came next. An 18-year-old boy, whose fabricated anemia would never withstand re-examination, was declared recovered and fit for work. A woman in her 30s with an invented heart condition received a revised diagnosis indicating the issue had been stress-related and temporary. One by one, they signed death sentences in the form of medical clearances, justifying each decision with clinical language that masked the horror of what they were actually doing. The remaining 8 vulnerable cases they attempted to shore up with additional documentation. Margarete spent Monday morning creating supplementary medical notes that added depth and credibility to diagnoses that had originally been hastily fabricated. She invented consultation records, suggesting she had sought Dr. Bachmann's opinion on complex cases, and he signed them without hesitation, lending his authority to her deceptions. They manufactured correspondence with fictional specialists at regional hospitals, discussing treatment protocols for unusual presentations of common diseases. The forgery expanded from simple blood test manipulation into an elaborate construction of false medical narratives, complete with invented patient histories and fabricated treatment responses. It was exhausting, meticulous work that required them to think like both doctors and detectives, anticipating every question Dr. Steiner might ask and preparing answers that would seem clinically reasonable while concealing the truth beneath layers of technical language. Monday afternoon brought the first wave of transports resulting from their weekend triage. Margarete watched from the laboratory window as 15 prisoners she and Dr. Bachmann had condemned filed past under guard, heading toward the railway station. Among them was Miriam Weiss, the 16-year-old girl whose blood infection had never existed, and whose miraculous recovery Margarete had documented 2 days earlier. Miriam walked with her head down, clutching a small bundle that contained everything she owned, unaware that the nurse who had once protected her had now sacrificed her to save others. Margarete turned away from the window before the column disappeared from view, unable to watch the complete consequence of her choices. She returned to the examination table, where new prisoners waited for screening, drawing their blood with hands that functioned on autopilot while her mind catalogued the names of the dead and the temporarily saved. That night she didn't sleep at all, lying in her narrow bed and staring at the ceiling while trying to convince herself that saving 40 lives justified condemning 15, that moral mathematics could somehow balance an equation written in human blood. The numbers refused to add up to anything resembling peace. Dr. Friedrich Steiner arrived Tuesday morning with the methodical precision of a man who believed absolutely in the power of documentation to reveal truth. He was younger than Margarete had expected, perhaps 40 years old, with wire-rimmed glasses and the lean build of someone who approached life with disciplined intensity. He wore his SS uniform with academic correctness rather than military swagger, and he carried that leather briefcase like it contained sacred texts. The camp commandant escorted him to the medical facility, where Margarete and Dr. Bachmann stood waiting in their white coats, 2 medical professionals about to undergo an examination far more rigorous than any they had ever administered. Dr. Steiner shook their hands with formal courtesy, arranged his materials on the examination table with geometric precision, and announced that he would begin by reviewing the statistical summary reports before proceeding to individual case files. His voice was calm and emotionless, the tone of a scientist approaching an interesting problem rather than an inquisitor hunting for treason. Margarete recognized immediately that this made him far more dangerous than any overtly hostile interrogator would have been. The inspection lasted 4 days, and each one felt like a separate eternity of controlled terror. Dr. Steiner worked with relentless thoroughness, beginning each morning at precisely 7 o'clock and continuing until the light failed in the evening. He reviewed every medical report Margarete had filed over the past 6 months, cross-referencing them against camp population records, transport logs, and regional disease statistics he had brought from Berlin. He created charts tracking the progression of tuberculosis cases over time, noting seasonal variations and demographic patterns. He questioned Margarete's diagnostic criteria, asking her to explain the specific symptoms and test results that had led to particular conclusions. She answered each question with as much clinical detail as she could muster, walking the razor's edge between appearing knowledgeable and appearing defensive. Dr. Bachmann sat beside her during these interrogations, occasionally interjecting with supporting observations that lent credibility to her explanations. They had rehearsed some of these exchanges during their Sunday collaboration, but many of Dr. Steiner's questions went in directions they hadn't anticipated, forcing Margarete to improvise medical justifications for decisions she had made based on desperation rather than diagnosis. On Wednesday, Dr. Steiner announced that he wanted to personally re-examine every prisoner currently housed in the isolation ward. This was the moment Margarete had been dreading most. The fabricated illnesses that existed perfectly on paper would now face the scrutiny of physical examination by an expert who actually understood the diseases she had invented. Dr. Steiner moved through the isolation ward with clinical detachment, examining prisoners one by one, while Margarete stood beside him explaining each case history. When he examined Sarah Rosenfeld, he spent nearly 30 minutes listening to her lungs, reviewing the temperature charts Margarete had created, and asking detailed questions about her symptoms over the months of supposed tuberculosis treatment. Sarah, who had been coached by Margarete during a brief whispered conversation the previous evening, described a cough that had gradually improved, night sweats that had diminished, and fatigue that still persisted. Dr. Steiner made extensive notes but offered no immediate judgment. He moved on to David Cohn, the bookseller with the fabricated kidney disorder, conducting tests of his urine and blood pressure while questioning why certain treatment protocols hadn't been attempted. The re-examinations consumed 2 full days, during which Margarete existed in a state of suspended dread, waiting for the moment when Dr. Steiner would declare that a patient showed no signs of the disease attributed to them. But that moment never came with the explosive certainty she had feared. Instead, Dr. Steiner's conclusions emerged gradually through a series of marginal notations in his reports and carefully phrased observations. On Thursday evening, he summoned Margarete and Dr. Bachmann to review his preliminary findings. He explained that he had identified several cases where the diagnoses appeared to be based on borderline test results that could be interpreted in multiple ways. He noted that Margarete seemed to have a tendency toward overly cautious diagnosis, erring on the side of declaring prisoners unfit for transport when their conditions might not strictly warrant such extreme precaution. He suggested that this excessive caution was creating inefficiencies in the transport system and consuming medical resources that could be better utilized elsewhere. It was a criticism, but it was not an accusation of deliberate sabotage. Dr. Steiner was framing Margarete's deception as incompetence rather than treason, and she couldn't determine whether this was because he genuinely believed that or because he had his own reasons for avoiding a more explosive conclusion. Dr. Bachmann seized on this interpretation with unexpected skill, agreeing that perhaps they had both been overly conservative in their medical assessments due to concerns about disease spread in the camp. He suggested that clearer diagnostic criteria from Berlin would help them make more consistent decisions. Dr. Steiner nodded thoughtfully and proposed that he would draft revised guidelines for medical screening at labor camps, using Margarete's facility as a test case for implementation. He indicated that several prisoners currently in isolation would need to be reassessed using these stricter criteria, and that many of them would likely be cleared for transport or return to the labor force. He would submit his final report to the regional SS medical office within 2 weeks, recommending both the new guidelines and closer oversight of diagnostic procedures at this particular camp. Then Dr. Steiner packed his briefcase, shook their hands once more and departed on Friday afternoon, leaving behind a facility that had survived his inspection but would now operate under far more restrictive conditions. Margarete had escaped execution, but the price of that survival was the end of her ability to save lives through medical deception. The narrow window she had exploited for 6 months was closing, and she could feel the walls of the system contracting around her remaining freedom of action. The 2 weeks following Dr. Steiner's departure transformed the medical facility into something resembling a prison within a prison. New protocols arrived from Berlin in the form of dense bureaucratic documents that specified exact diagnostic criteria for every possible illness. Blood test results now required verification signatures from both Margarete and Dr. Bachmann. Any diagnosis of tuberculosis had to be confirmed through multiple sputum samples examined over a minimum period of 5 days. Heart conditions required documented electrocardiogram readings, which the camp didn't possess the equipment to perform, effectively eliminating that avenue of fabrication entirely. Most devastating of all, the isolation ward population was capped at 20 prisoners maximum, and any patient who remained there longer than 4 weeks without showing measurable improvement had to be either cleared for transport or transferred to a designated medical facility in the east, which everyone understood was simply another route to the same death. The bureaucratic noose had tightened to the point where Margarete's acts of medical resistance became nearly impossible to execute without immediate detection. The immediate consequence of these new restrictions was a purge of the isolation ward that Margarete was powerless to prevent. Dr. Bachmann received direct orders to reassess every prisoner currently in quarantine using the new diagnostic criteria. Margarete stood beside him as he examined patients whose fabricated illnesses could no longer be sustained under the stricter protocols. Sarah Rosenfeld, who had lived in isolation for nearly 4 months based on Margarete's invented tuberculosis diagnosis, was declared recovered and cleared for the general camp population. The relief Margarete felt at this outcome lasted only until she learned that Sarah's name appeared on the transport list for the following Thursday. David Cohn, whose kidney disorder had protected him for 3 months, failed to meet the new criteria for continued medical quarantine. A young couple, Ruth and Samuel Hoffman, who had both been diagnosed with suspicious blood abnormalities that Margarete had carefully documented, were reassessed and found fit for labor duties. Within 10 days of Dr. Steiner's inspection, the isolation ward population dropped from 62 prisoners to 18, and Margarete watched helplessly as those she had fought to protect were swept back into the system she had briefly held at bay. But something unexpected happened among the prisoners who remained in the camp after surviving Dr. Steiner's purge. Word had spread through the barracks about the nurse who falsified blood tests, though the stories circulated in whispers and were never spoken aloud where guards might hear. Margarete began to notice small gestures of gratitude that carried enormous risk for those who offered them. A prisoner working in the camp kitchen managed to leave an extra portion of bread outside the medical facility, with a tiny note that read only "Thank you" in pencil. Another prisoner, assigned to cleaning duties, deliberately took longer when sweeping near the laboratory, using those extra minutes to warn Margarete when SS officers were approaching. Sarah Rosenfeld, now back in the general population and awaiting transport, found a way to pass a message through another prisoner during a medical screening. The note, written on a scrap of cloth, simply said that Sarah would carry Margarete's name in her heart wherever the trains took her, and that if she survived, she would tell the world what one German nurse had tried to do. These small acts of recognition brought Margarete no comfort. Instead, they amplified her sense of failure and the inadequacy of her resistance. She had saved perhaps 40 or 50 lives temporarily, delaying their deaths by weeks or months, while thousands of prisoners had passed through the camp during her time there and been transported to destinations from which none returned. The mathematics of her defiance were humbling in their insignificance. For every person she had protected through medical fraud, 10 others had died whom she had never even examined. Her resistance had been selective by necessity, limited by the constraints of her position and the need to avoid detection, but those practical limitations did nothing to ease the guilt of those she couldn't save. She began to understand that the true psychological torture of her situation was not the fear of discovery, but the burden of choosing who would live and who would die based on arbitrary factors, like the day they happened to appear for medical screening, or whether their case file could support a convincing fabrication. The breaking point of Margarete's ability to continue functioning came in late June, when a new group of prisoners arrived at the camp from liquidated ghettos in occupied Poland. Among them was a woman in her early 30s named Anna Bergman, who was brought to the medical facility for routine screening. Anna was 8 months pregnant, her condition obvious despite the loose camp uniform she wore. Margarete examined her, and found both mother and unborn child in reasonable health considering the circumstances. But she also knew with absolute certainty what would happen next. Pregnant women were never kept in labor camps. They represented a drain on resources without providing useful work, and the Nazi regime had explicit policies regarding Jewish births. Anna would be on the next transport, which departed in 3 days. Margarete stood in the laboratory after completing the examination, staring at the medical form she needed to file, knowing that there was no diagnosis she could fabricate that would protect a visibly pregnant woman. No amount of creative paperwork could hide an 8-month pregnancy from visual inspection. For the first time since she had begun her campaign of medical resistance, Margarete faced a situation where her skills as a forger were completely useless. She filled out Anna's medical form with accurate information, signed her name at the bottom, and submitted it to Dr. Bachmann, knowing that she had just documented a death sentence she was powerless to prevent. That night, Margarete broke down completely in her quarters, sobbing with a grief and rage that she had suppressed for months. The morning Anna Bergman was scheduled for transport, Margarete Fischer made a decision that abandoned every principle of self-preservation she had maintained for 6 months. She arrived at the medical facility before dawn, broke into the locked cabinet where Dr. Bachmann stored official SS medical forms, and began forging documents that she knew could never withstand even cursory scrutiny. She created a false medical emergency report claiming that Anna had developed severe preeclampsia during the night, a pregnancy complication that posed immediate risk to both mother and child. She backdated examination notes to make it appear that Anna had been under observation for this condition for the past week. Then she did something that crossed a line even her previous deceptions had never approached. She forged Dr. Bachmann's signature on a medical order, mandating Anna's immediate transfer to a civilian hospital in Munich for emergency obstetric care, citing regulations that required preservation of Aryan genetic material, even when carried by non-Aryan mothers, in cases where paternity was disputed or unknown. It was an absurd fabrication that referenced policies Margarete wasn't even certain existed, built on a foundation of lies so transparent that discovery was inevitable rather than merely possible. Margarete personally escorted Anna to the camp administrative office at 6 in the morning, before most of the SS officers had arrived for duty, and presented the forged transfer orders to a tired clerk who barely glanced at the paperwork before stamping it approved. She then walked Anna to the camp gates, handed the documents to the guards, and watched as a confused and terrified pregnant woman was loaded into a transport vehicle that would supposedly take her to a Munich hospital. Margarete had no idea whether the driver would actually follow those orders or simply redirect to the railway station once outside the camp perimeter. She had no illusion that her forgery would survive review once higher-ranking officers examined the paperwork. She had simply reached a point where witnessing one more preventable death without attempting even a futile gesture of resistance would have shattered something essential in her capacity to remain human. As Anna's transport vehicle disappeared down the road, Margarete returned to the medical facility and waited for the consequences she knew were coming. The investigation began 4 hours later, when Dr. Bachmann arrived at the facility and discovered what Margarete had done. He found her sitting calmly in the laboratory, making no attempt to hide the evidence or construct a defense. She had left the cabinet with the medical forms partially open, the forged documents still visible on her desk. Dr. Bachmann stood in the doorway for a long moment, his face drained of color, before quietly closing the door behind him. He asked her a single question in a voice barely above a whisper. Why had she thrown away everything? Sacrificed any possibility of continuing to help prisoners through careful deception, for one woman and one unborn child whom she couldn't realistically save? Margarete looked at him directly and answered that she had finally understood the fundamental flaw in her entire strategy of calculated resistance. She had been operating under the delusion that she could save some lives while accepting the deaths of others, that she could choose who deserved her protection based on rational assessments of risk and probability. But the moment she had examined Anna Bergman and accepted that a pregnant woman's death was simply too dangerous to prevent, she had become complicit in the very system she believed she was resisting. Dr. Bachmann listened to her explanation with an expression that moved between horror and something that might have been understanding. Then he told Margarete that the transport vehicle carrying Anna had indeed been redirected to the railway station within 20 minutes of leaving the camp, that SS officers were already reviewing the fraudulent medical orders, and that Sturmbannführer Kraus had been notified of a serious security breach in the medical facility. He estimated that Margarete had perhaps 2 hours before formal arrest, possibly less. He offered her the only help that remained within his power to give. He had access to a storage closet near the camp's eastern fence where maintenance supplies were kept, and he knew the guard rotation schedule well enough to identify a 15-minute window each evening, when that section of the perimeter was temporarily unwatched during shift change. If Margarete could reach that closet by 7 o'clock tonight, she might be able to cut through a weak section of fence and escape into the forest beyond. It wasn't much of a plan. The odds of successful evasion were minimal, but it was marginally better than waiting for the Gestapo to arrive. Margarete spent the next 6 hours in a state of eerie calm, continuing her normal medical duties as if nothing had changed. She examined prisoners, drew blood samples, filed routine reports, and maintained the fiction of normalcy, even as she could hear increased SS activity outside the medical facility. At noon, a messenger arrived with orders for her to report to the commandant's office at 4 o'clock that afternoon, confirming that formal proceedings against her were being prepared. She acknowledged the message without emotion and returned to her work. At 3:30, she walked calmly to her quarters, collected nothing except a small photograph of her parents that she kept hidden in her pillowcase, and made her way toward the eastern section of the camp. She passed Dr. Bachmann near the isolation ward, and they exchanged a glance that contained everything that couldn't be spoken. Then Margarete Fischer, who had spent 6 months trying to save lives through careful deception, walked deliberately toward an escape attempt she suspected would fail, but refused to abandon because the alternative was accepting that her resistance had ended in complete futility. What happened to Margarete Fischer after she reached that eastern fence remains a story wrapped in the fog of war and conflicting accounts that were never fully reconciled. Some records suggest she was captured within hours of her escape attempt, executed by firing squad 2 days later, and buried in an unmarked grave outside the camp perimeter. Other fragmentary evidence hints at a different outcome. A woman matching her description was reportedly seen in a Munich hospital 3 weeks after her disappearance, working under a false identity as a cleaning staff member. Decades later, a survivor named Sarah Rosenfeld testified that she had received a brief letter in 1946 from someone who signed only with the initial M, written in handwriting she recognized, claiming to be alive in Argentina. The truth is that Margarete Fischer vanished from official records in June of 1942, and whether she died attempting to escape or somehow survived the war remains one of those historical mysteries that will likely never be definitively answered. What is certain is that the isolation ward she had maintained through medical fraud was shut down within days of her disappearance, its remaining prisoners dispersed to transports heading east. The question that haunts this story is not whether Margarete Fischer was a hero, but whether heroism even exists in a system designed to make resistance futile. She saved perhaps 50 lives through 6 months of falsifying blood tests, while tens of thousands died in the broader machinery of the Holocaust that her small acts of sabotage couldn't even slow down. She made impossible choices about which prisoners deserved protection, effectively condemning some to save others within a quota system that ensured the total number of deaths remained constant, regardless of her interventions. She collaborated daily with the Nazi regime, wearing its uniform, following its procedures, and enabling its function even as she tried to subvert it from within. These are uncomfortable truths that don't fit neatly into narratives of heroic resistance. They reveal instead the moral complexity of living under totalitarian systems where every action, including acts of defiance, becomes contaminated by the evil they attempt to resist. Margarete Fischer was neither a saint nor simply a functionary. She was an ordinary person trapped in extraordinary circumstances who made decisions that saved some lives and failed to save others. What makes her story significant is not that it provides clear moral lessons or inspires uncomplicated admiration, but that it forces us to confront questions we would prefer to avoid. What would you have done in her position? knowing that every prisoner you saved through fraud meant another prisoner took their place on the transport list. At what point does resistance within a genocidal system become mere performance that assuages personal guilt while changing nothing substantive? Is it better to save 50 lives temporarily through deception than to save no lives while maintaining personal moral purity through non-participate? High on. These are not theoretical questions. They are the actual dilemmas faced by people who lived under Nazi occupation, and the answers are far more complicated than we usually acknowledge. Margarete Fischer's story matters because it refuses to let us retreat into comfortable judgments about what we would have done differently or better. It places us directly in her laboratory, holding that vial of blood, staring at test results we could manipulate, and forces us to decide. The prisoners Margarete temporarily saved through falsified blood tests faced varied fates that reflect the chaotic brutality of the Holocaust's final years. Sarah Rosenfeld survived 3 different concentration camps and eventually emigrated to New York, where she lived until 1998. She spoke publicly about the nurse who had protected her only twice, once in testimony at a war crimes trial in 1961, and once in a recorded interview for a Holocaust memorial project. David Cohn, the bookseller, died in Auschwitz in January of 1943, 3 months after his protection in the isolation ward ended. Of the approximately 50 prisoners whose lives Margarete extended through medical fraud, perhaps 8 to 10 survived the war based on fragmentary post-war records and survivor testimonies. The rest disappeared into the systematic murder of European Jewry, their few extra weeks or months of life becoming footnotes in a catastrophe measured in millions. This brutal arithmetic doesn't diminish what Margarete attempted, but it does force honest reckoning with the limitations of individual resistance against industrial-scale genocide. What this story adds to your understanding of World War II and the Holocaust is the reminder that history is made by individual people, making individual choices in moments of impossible pressure, not by abstract forces or inevitable trajectories. Margarete Fischer was not a resistance leader or a political activist. She was a nurse who took the Hippocratic Oath seriously enough to commit treason. Her story exists in the vast grey area between collaboration and resistance, where most people actually lived during the Nazi era, trying to survive while retaining some fragment of their humanity. We tell these stories not because they provide comfortable heroes to admire, but because they force us to think seriously about what moral behavior actually looks like under conditions of totalitarian control. They challenge us to consider how we would respond if our professional skills, our daily work, became tools of oppression. Would you falsify the blood tests? Would you save some prisoners knowing others would die in their place? Would you risk everything for one pregnant woman when rational calculation said the attempt was futile? These questions don't have easy answers, and that's exactly why Margarete Fischer's story cannot be forgotten. It demands that we confront the complexity of human choice under impossible circumstances, and it refuses to let us believe that we would automatically do better. Her legacy is not heroic inspiration, but uncomfortable truth, and sometimes that's the most valuable thing history can offer.